Alhamdulillah, wassalatu wassalamu ala rasulillah. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, and welcome back to this Voice of Islam platform. Saturday night, or depending on where you are, it could be early in the morning, it could be any time in the world. In fact, if you're in America, like Fahad Taslim is. Sheikh Fahad, how are you? Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullah. Eid Mubarak.
Yeah, Eid Mubarak. Taqabbalallahu minna wa minkum.
Ameen, ameen. Jazakallah khair. So how's everything over there?
Oh,
So it is, to answer your question, it's about 2:20 over here
so
in the afternoon.
2:20 in the afternoon. Okay,
Yeah.
that's good. And it is now 8:20 p.m. my time. And
Ah.
then Jamshed in Wales, it must be
Yes.
at least, what
It's
is
eight.
it?
It's 8:18 here.
8:18.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa
Walaikum
barakatuh.
salam
So this
wa
means
Ah,
we can actually tell Sheikh Fahad the future because we are 6 hours in the future. We can tell him what's going to happen.
You
Wow,
know,
excuse
Yeah.
me. In New Zealand, we're even more in the future.
you know,
We're
I was,
on
you know, I was
Sunday
just about to
morning
say
at
that.
7:20 a.m. So we can tell you.
No, I'll tell you something interesting. When I was in New Zealand, and I'll make this really quick because I know Yusuf wants to get on with the introductions. When we
Yeah.
were in New Zealand, I was in. We were on our way somewhere. I forgot. I think we were going to. I forgot which town we're going to. We're in the van, and my son called me, and he said he said something about like, oh, I want to fast tomorrow or something like that. And I said, okay, but but you already missed the train. He said, what do you mean? I'm like, well, it's already Friday. He goes, no, over here it's Thursday. Or I think it was like Thursday and then Wednesday. So, and I was like, no, but you have to wait until tomorrow. But we're in the future.
Yeah.
And then he said something like, well, it's already Maghrib, so then for me and you, it's still the same day. So he was very quick on the whole difference between like the Gregorian calendar and the lunar calendar. Anyway, but yeah, so New Zealand is far in the future than all of us, I think.
Absolutely. So we've got also Sheikh Jazakallah Khair from that explanation of your time zone in America, and we're going to be hearing a little bit probably about Zayd,
hear me, bro? You gonna
a
go
guy
again?
called Zayd. Yes, Wasim, I can hear you. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Can you hear me?
Assalamu wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Hear me? Can you? No. Okay, guys, we're
Okay.
trying to get live with everyone from around the different parts of the world that they live in. Zayd, of course, is a time traveler, and I believe that that's where all this discussion came from Quantum Chronicles.
Yeah.
Zayd. Yes, I bet you're getting in the neck over that still. Yeah. Okay, who else is with us? Wasim, is he with us or is he with the Woolwich? That you would only understand that if you were Jamshed.
I didn't
Are
get
you-
that. Is he with
Yeah.
who? The Wolves?
With the Woolwich. With the
Woolwich.
Woolwich. It's an old shop that used to have an advert. It said, you're either with us or you're with the Woolwich. Anyway, just
Okay.
leave it alone.
That was before my time, bro.
Okay, guys. So, Bismillah. Okay, there's a lot of issues that we're going to try and deal with today, and I guess it's probably going to get beyond one or two on the list. Okay, the first one, as is this, the nature of this show, is to deal with questions that people are struggling with, that people are maybe having causing dissension with. Conversations between mothers and fathers and brothers and sisters, neighbors, work colleagues, etc. So, there are a lot of things we can deal with. Number one on my list was science and the Quran. Science and the Quran. Now, Wasim Kempson, can you hear us? No, he can't. Okay, so science and the Quran was the issue that we were going to deal with today. First of all, what does science mean? So, because a lot of people are baffled by terminology, by language, by genre, by universities and, maths and science and technology and so on and so forth. And there's a massive jargon that comes with it. So, first of all, Fahad, what is
Yes.
science? Essentially, from an Islamic perspective or from a human perspective, what do you think
Sure.
science is?
Sure. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. So, I mean, science, as it's colloquially understood, in the English language is basically the endeavor to find out the truth about the created world. I guess that's maybe not colloquial, that's more Islamic, right? So in the sense that you have certain phenomena that happen within the natural world, and in order to find out how those systems work, what is the reality of those systems, you use the tool of science, right? And perhaps more specifically, you would say that there's a certain method that you use to reach those conclusions when it comes to the natural world, right? So that system that you use to reach those conclusions about the truth about the natural world is called science. So within that, it's a way to understand the truth. It's a tool that you use to understand truth within the natural world. But you'll notice I'm stressing on the idea of within the natural world, because that is one of while it is an amazing tool to get us to understand certain truths about our natural world, but that is also its limitation. So, for instance, things within the realm, some things which are outside of the realm of science are things like meaning. So meaning is not a scientific question, right? That's what you might call more of a metaphysical question as opposed to a physical question, right? What does it all mean? Similarly, science is amoral, meaning there's no moral judgments in science. Science cannot tell you about morality, etc. So again, it is an endeavor to understand the physical, natural world that we live in. And there is a specific method by which it does that. So that's what we would call science in a nutshell.
Okay. That's a good starting position. So we're talking about science. Talking of science, do we have Wasim with us? Is he listening? Can you hear us? No.
The science has failed us.
Hebba, yes, because time is related to, of course, science is related to time and our ability to observe the natural world, isn't it, Fahad?
Yeah, so I mean, the comment that you have that Sister Hiba has there, science is the source of, or science, Quran is the source of science, knowledge, and wisdom. I don't know if it's exactly correct. Meaning, so obviously the natural world is how we go about scientific, with the scientific method. Now, the Quran, you could say, maybe the inspiration for pursuing certain scientific endeavors. Right? So when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, Inna fi khalqis samawati wal ard wa ikhtilafi layli wan nahar, in the creation of the heavens and the earth and the alteration of the night and day are indeed signs. So this may be an inspiration to now go towards the natural world and go, and understand like how the natural world works. So it may be a motivation towards science, but the Quran itself, as this is, and it's almost cliche now, but the Quran itself is not a book of science. It's a book of signs, right? We always say that, right? It's not a book that's going to tell you about specifically the scientific method or something like that. Rather, it is a book that's going to be pointing you towards signs, let's say, within the natural world, which eventually point you towards signs of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So there's a little bit of a distinction. Now, she continued and said it's a source of knowledge. True. It's a source of wisdom. Absolutely true. We totally agree with that. But in terms of science, we need to be a little more airtight with our definition because there's a lot of confusion that arises when we talk about science and how the Quran is related to that.
Because people are using those terms liberally and interchangeably with the Quran, and they're causing some confusion, whereas I understand that the Quran is a book of ayat, of signs, not science.
Yes.
So this is one of the points that we want to start with. Jamshed, you want to add anything to that?
Wa alaikum assalam.
No, not really. I think everything's been said. Really, fundamentally, it's just to understand that science, as Sheikh Fahad mentioned, is literally it's not a thing. It's just a methodology by which you can understand the natural world, i.e., that which is physical, that which is observable. And whilst it is a very good process to do that, we just have to recognize that it has its limitations. It's just a method. Wait, I can hear myself.
Sorry. My team over here.
Yeah, no worries. And not only that, you also have to recognize that science is not the only way that we can come to truth. So so to use the term that Sheikh Fahd used last week, epistemology. Like, how do we know anything? We know things because of because of science, but we can also deduce things from logic, and science relies upon logic first and foremost, from our own personal experiences, from testimony, what other people tell us, from sensory perception. So there's a lot of different mechanisms by which we can come to know anything. Science is just only a small part of that, and it's when we move science out of that and make it the be-all and end-all of everything do we start to encounter problems. Because there's that maxim which is, for example, if you only have a hammer, then everything looks like nails. If you only resort to just looking at things from a scientific perspective, and I'm going to come back to this because I think this is going to come back in one of the questions afterwards, but if you only look at things from a scientific perspective, then it means you force yourself to have to come up with some kind of a naturalistic conclusion to any question. And that's fundamentally impossible in some cases. It just can't be done. So as a community, we have to recognize that, yes, while science is definitely a very, very useful and proper process, it has its limitations and it needs to be used correctly and in the right place.
Good. Talking about limitations then, Fahad, if we go and look at what a science does in a scientist, a person who fundamentally observation of the natural world in a sort of structured way, okay? Is it possible that they can come to conclusions which are absolute in science?
No. So this is one of the things that we, and as Jamshed was mentioning earlier, that if we make the assumption that science is your only epistemic tool, I mean, that is the only tool you can the only tool you can use, to arrive to truth, this becomes problematic because science cannot get you to 100% truth or certainty, right? And this becomes a bit, and people kind of, they may say, hold on a second. We understand we have observation. There's certain things that we observe and we know them for sure. But there's a difference here. When we're talking about observation, there's certain things that you observe and you know for sure. So we're not talking about that. We're talking about something that comes under the empirical method by which you come to truth, right? That science relies upon. So that method has to do with testing, right? So there's observation, there's the hypothesis, what you're going to say about the particular phenomena, and then there's testing involved. The process of science, and this is really important, when it comes to science, we have to understand that it works, one of its limitations, we can say, is that it works with what we call, it doesn't give you deductive conclusions. It works on an inductive methodology. Okay, what does that mean? What it means is that let's say that you observe 10,000 black crows. Okay, so you have a limited sample set and you make a general conclusion. All right, so I've observed 10,000 black crows, therefore crows are black. Okay, but it doesn't mean that you will never, ever, ever find a pink crow. So you can come to a very high level of certainty, but you can never come to 100% certainty, right? Because what that would mean is that you have observed everything in the past and everything in the future in every single corner of the world, right? Or in every single corner of the universe, forget the world. And that is an impossibility. So science, because it works with the process of induction as opposed to deduction, right? So when we have a deductive method, you have premises and then you have conclusions. So if I said, for instance, that all presidents, you have, let's say, two premises. Number one, all presidents of the United States are men or were men. Okay. Donald Trump, premise number two, Donald Trump is the president of the United States. Conclusion, Donald Trump is a man. This is a deductive way by which you're coming to a conclusion. As long as premises one is correct and premises two is correct, and you know that for sure, premise three by deduction has to be true. Science does not work like that. It works via an inductive method. You have a limited sample set and you make a generalization. And therefore, you cannot come to 100%. You cannot come to 100% certainty, right? 100% yaqeen via science alone.
Okay. That gives us a position. First of all, when you're talking about science and the Quran, one has to first understand what is science and what do you understand from science and its connectivity with the Quran?
Can I just add one point to that, please?
Yes, go
Sure.
for it.
Yeah, just in response to what you were talking about, the question, can science lead us to 100% truth? It's also important to recognize the semantic issue of what is truth here, right? Because the context of 100% truth matters. Now, a very simple example, what temperature does water boil at? We're taught that water boils at 100 degrees centigrade, right? But is that 100% true? It's not, because if you change the atmospheric conditions, so for example, if you go higher up in the atmosphere where there is less atmospheric pressure, or I'm sure if there are substances that you can put into the water, that changes its boiling point. So it's still, from one perspective, it's still 100% true to say water boils at 100 degrees C, but that's not the whole story. You can still fine tune what is the actual rule for water boiling, and you also get like multiple different ways to explain the same thing, but there's certain semantic differences as well that become important when you start to reach what's known as the boundary conditions. So, for example, we can say, fine, water boils at 100%, 100 degrees, which is true. We could also say water boils when the temperature of the water reaches such that it breaks free of the atmospheric restrictions, which is a little bit more complicated. But again, that's a different explanation, but it works with a variety of other situations as well. So we have to be careful not to ground ourselves just because someone has come up with a particular way of explaining one thing. That doesn't make it the be-all and end-all for that thing in every single situation and every single circumstance. I hope that makes sense.
Okay, thanks very much for that, Jamshed. Yes, we understand that. And essentially, basically, where this conversation started out with is around probably in history it's happened before, maybe. It may have happened, but as far as we understand, Dr. Morris Bukhari was working with the Saudis in the 70s, and he came up with this whole concept of science and the Quran. And then it was popularized through a number of du'at around the world, like, Ahmed Deedat, Dr. Zakir Naik, so on and so forth. And then it became popularized and it became mainstream. Started off as a mainstream thing that Muslims saying, yeah, but I can prove that, Islam is scientific in every aspect because the Quran says this, and this, and the scientists say this. And so what happened was Dr. Morris Bukhari got a collection of scientists together. He put them in front of, a live audience, and he got them to say certain things about science and relating it to verses in the Quran. So the question is this the correct approach? As we understand that the Mufassirin, the people who decipher the ayat of the Quran, had not looked at the Quran hitherto before that in this way. So let's move to Fahad and then try and analyze this, break it down, and
Sure.
see where do we lie in this situation as practicing Muslims.
Okay, so I think the discussion needs to, after we've understood science, we understood that, Jamshed mentioned, and I think I was mentioning, that it's going to have certain limitations, right? So even when we come to the idea of certainty, it's going to have limitations. Now, those limitations, in fact, are one of the beauties of science itself, right? Because one of the things that is beautiful about science, the idea of observing the natural world, is that there is so much to discover, and there's so much yet to discover. So therefore, science is not like a monolithic block that you either have or you don't have. There's always new discoveries to happen, right? And the reason why is because science is mutable, right? There can be an observation that you have, let's say 5 years from now, that completely contradicts conclusions that are reached to today, right? Because one of the limitations of science is observation, right? You could develop tools in the future that give us the ability to observe areas that we were never able to observe before, right? Just speaking about one of the limitations of science. So science as an epistemic endeavor, as an endeavor to reach truth, is mutable. In other words, it is changing. Now, one of the problems is when you take this mutable endeavor to reach truth and you compare it to something like the Quran, which we say is not mutable, okay, we see a certain problem. You have a mutable endeavor, and you're saying we're going to use this mutable tool to show that this absolute thing is true. You see what the issue is now, right? You have an absolute thing, which is the Quran. You have a mutable endeavor, and you're saying, I'm going to use this changeable, mutable epistemic tool to show that the Quran is true. Why does this become problematic? Is because as science discovers more things, we get into more realms, then those connections that were made in the past, if they're made in a way that's absolute, that is going to have those are going to have serious ramifications on someone's iman if the assumption is the Quran is always scientifically accurate. Because if it's always scientifically accurate, the assumption is science never changes. What happens when it changes, right? What does that mean about the Quran? Just to give you a practical example, okay? We had some young people that came to me after, they were, when I was studying at UT Austin, and they came to me and they said, we went to our geology professor, and we told him that the Quran is scientifically accurate, right? And the Quran says, "Wal jibala awtada," right? That the mountains, they're like pegs. So the geology professor told these young people, they said, wait a minute, but, that may make some sense, but it's actually dated science, because now we understand, the geological formations having more to do with tectonic plates. And so really the concept of mountains being pegs, it seems like your book is archaic and outdated. The science in your book is wrong. Now imagine what that means to those young people who come to me and say, like, well, now what do we do, right? I mean, this guy has a PhD in geology, he got it from Harvard and all these. And so it comes down to methodology, right? We do not, and this is why it's very dangerous to say that the Quran is scientific miracles. Because the hidden assumption, or the assumption we're making, is that science doesn't change and you can come to absolute conclusions within science. That is very flawed. And so
So basically, a scientist will arrive at a particular understanding of what the mountain does and how it stabilizes, or so on and so forth, and how it forms the geology and helps to support that geology. And then later on, they then may change their position because somebody else observes, another group of scientists observe something else and say, no, we're reverting back to our previous understanding of the mountain.
Or a new understanding. A new understanding, right? Yeah, and the thing is, look, anyone that is a practitioner of science, even on a practical level, like you ask doctors, right? And doctors understand this like immediately, because they're bombarded by new research every day, right? A particular medicine, it has, it's gone through some trials, they've done some tests, and it's effective in XYZ group. And then, some time comes along, they do other trials, and all of a sudden, well, this drug is, it has these particular limitations, we didn't know about it, and so now we're discovering something new. So practitioners of science, and this is something you'll notice, they're very careful when they use terms like scientific fact, right? In fact, you'll find it's very rare they say this is a scientific fact. What they'll say is that this is what we know, this is what our current knowledge points towards, or this is what the research shows. And so based on our studies, these are the conclusions we can reach. They're very careful in how they phrase those things, because they understand science is a mutable endeavor. And that's what makes science beautiful at its core anyways, that it's something where you're constantly and you're discovering more and more about the natural world. So
constantly in a learning environment when you're in the nature, the natural world around you.
Yep.
And of course, they haven't gone even a tiny percentage of the oceans, let alone seen the universe, so they can't make absolute statements about it. What I'd like to say, though, is, okay, so what about the obvious signs that are written about the mountains, the oceans, about the bees, about the planets, about the earth, about the moon, so on and so forth? All of these signs that we see in the Quran, and there are hundreds, and probably getting to thousands, but we haven't found them all.
Yeah.
Okay. Now, how does I mean, and this is a question for Jamshed as well as, sorry, I don't want to totally go to America for all the answers. I know we're doing that constantly as British. But, you know, how can we use those signs in our dawah discussions? That to me is really the way forward. Go for it.
Okay, right. To answer that question, let me go back a very, very little bit. Just to go back over the phrase that the Quran is not a book of science, but it's a book of science. Now, I know a lot of people say this, but I feel that a lot of people, especially people who aspire to become du'at, don't understand what this actually means. So when we say the Quran is not a book of science, the Quran is what? The Quran is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's speech to mankind. It's Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's, as one very famous guy puts it, Allah's love letter to mankind, to basically inviting us to know Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, to worship Him, and to know things around us. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala never talks about scientific things like, oh, you will discover that water is made out of hydrogen and oxygen and this, that, and the other. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala doesn't make statements like this. He doesn't give you recipes for scientific calculations and things like that. So it's not a book of science in that respect. It's a book of science where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala talks about the nature of reality, and when those things are being mentioned, it's being mentioned in many or majority of the cases with respect to the magnificence of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. But those statements conform. So our position is those statements conform to what reality is, even though in some cases they may contradict what was perceived to be the reality at the time. So, but the problem is, and I know I'm speaking very abstract, I'm going to make this a concrete example shortly. The problem is when we take those statements and we form one perspective of, oh, this is what it means, and then we try to apply that onto a scientific discovery, and then when one thing or the other shifts, then we have a problem because we anchored it to something that it shouldn't have been anchored to. Now, the way that I prefer to do this, to answer to your question specifically, is, and this has worked for me on a couple of occasions. I actually ask people, if imagine that you were authoring the Quran, you were speaking to mankind, and you wanted to emphasize that you were going to resurrect people exactly as they were, right down to the last detail, right? You're going to, and you're talking to people, from 14 centuries ago, but you also want this to be relevant for every person, every nation, every generation since. How would you make that statement? What kind of a statement would you come up with? And I've had various responses to this, people saying, oh, well, I'll say we'll resurrect you right down to every hair on your head and this, that, and the other. But there's problems with those statements in that, well, in my case, I'm going bald. The amount of hair that you have changes, the amount of cells that you have changes, the amount of a lot of different things change over time. Only one person actually has ever given me the correct answer, which is to say, your fingerprints. Can you guys hear me? No, we can still hear you, Yusuf.
We can hear you.
We can hear you. I can hear you.
These platforms, they're not.
Yusuf, we can hear you, bro. Are you transmitting as well? All right, let me get Yusuf to. Sorry. Anyway, so only one person has actually ever given me the correct statement, which is to say that, well, actually, the best statement would be to reference the fingertips, reference your fingerprints, because your fingerprints uniquely identify you, and they don't change. And lo and behold, you just show them the opening of Surah Al-Qiyamah, where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentions that we'll resurrect them right down to the very fingertips. Now, for a person 14 centuries ago in the middle of the Arab nation, that would make sense to them that, okay, right, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala was talking about, okay, right down to the fingertips, the smallest thing that they would consider, oh, we're losing everybody. Whereas in our day and age now, we recognize through the scientific process that fingertips are unique to everyone. So we can appreciate this in a lot more detail. The problem is when people now start to say, oh, well, that's a scientifically accurate statement and this. And I mean, we've already established this, but what you should do is recognize the statement for what it is. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is talking about your resurrection right down to your last detail, and be focused on that. That look, your life has a purpose here, and your life will come to an end, and there will be a resurrection afterwards. Don't focus on, well, should it have been the fingertips, or should it have been the ear on the head, or should it have been this and that, because you're completely missing the point. And I think that's where a lot of du'at get stuck, in that you completely miss the point of what's being said, and then you judge the Quran based on an idea that was constructed solely in your own mind, and then you tried to link it to something else. Whilst I think I'm
Can I just add something to that?
Yeah,
if you
please.
can hear me, I'm still here.
Yeah.
I think my understanding is that yes, some of these things in the Quran is to make us think, to contemplate, to look at these things, to not take that as verbatim, but just to get the mind, the mind to start looking at these things and look and delve into it deeply. Yes, the fingerprints one hasn't changed, but some of the other ones might, like you said, the hair on your head, because I've even got less hair than you, so that's why it's covered up, keep me warm. But other things, because some say, oh yes, because it talks about the lying, sinful forelock, and they say this is the part of the brain where is that part of that is where those sort of thoughts come from, or actions. So, but to take those as verbatim, I think it's more to get the mind, because Allah's created the mind, the human mind, so vast that it's so powerful that we can contemplate. Because look at how much man has gone in its development over the thousands and thousands and thousands of years, and especially in the last couple of hundred years, how far it's developed. And I think it's all there. Like you said, the Quran is, like Sheikh Fahd was saying, the Quran is static. It's there. It's 100%. And the other things are changing. So what's in the Quran is to get us to look at those things and then see how far it goes. But when something is, the Quran is there, there's nothing, like I said, science is changing all the time. So the Quran's not. So we just have to look at those sort of things and just research and study, and then say, look, this is so wonderful, the creation, Allah's creation, and then be thankful and gratitude and show, bow to his power and mercy and submit as Muslim. That's my understanding.
Yeah, I mean, the power essentially there is that in the statements, they all conform to what is established reality.
Yes.
But the statements were not made there for you to start investigating those things and check the accuracy. It's more of a case of, particularly for our time, if you want to go into the scientific miracles, what you can say is that, look, any of the statements that the Quran makes about reality that we have confirmed, they all match, whereas you would not expect those particular statements to have been made 14 centuries ago because they simply didn't have the knowledge. Can I just relate one story, a very famous incident of where actually science did change and where this did affect the Muslims and the Quran? So everyone, obviously, we all know Professor Albert Einstein. There's a very famous story about what he considers to be the greatest blunder of his life. Now, the Quran mentions that the universe is expanding. The popular, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is talking about, we created the heavens and the earth and we continue to expand their vastness. Again, you can infer that to say, well, okay, yeah, the universe is expanding, and you could be forgiven for inferring that. But again, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is not making this as a scientific statement. But still, we'll take it as that for the moment. The popular thinking at the time, in the 1900s, was that the universe was static. And this was such a strong idea that when Albert Einstein came up with his theory of general relativity, which deals with gravity and mass and all these other kinds of things, he accidentally discovered that the universe was expanding. Because if you consider everything that has mass and it has gravity, everything should be attracting each other together, right? But the fact that the universe hasn't imploded means that either gravity is not there, but it is definitely, we know that from other experimentation, or the things are moving away as to counteract the force of gravity, which must mean therefore expansion of the universe. So we accidentally discovered this, but because that, and I'm paraphrasing the story here, there's a lot more nuance to it, but essentially because that also contradicted the normal idea, he came up with this thing called the cosmological constant, which tweaked his formula slightly so that the balance of the universe was on a knife edge where gravity did exist, but everything was positioned just so that they wouldn't attract each other, nor were they moving away. So everything was just like, can you imagine when you've stacked everything really exactly right and it's just balanced exactly? That's what this did. And it wasn't until about 15 or so years later when Professor Edwin Hubble, famous for the Hubble telescope, discovered through observation a phenomenon known as the redshift, which is when the light from distant galaxies tends towards red because it's being stretched, and basically proved and determined through observation that the universe must be expanding. That's the only possible explanation for this. At that point, then, did Einstein realize his mistake, that he had actually discovered this 15 or so years prior, but because of this consensus within the scientific community that was so strong that the universe is static, it just basically got covered up. And at the time, before this happened, the scientists were pointing at the Muslims, oh, your Quran says the universe is expanding, but it's static, this, that, and the other, blah, blah, blah. We've got equations proving it. And lo and behold, through observation now, because we can see the redshift, and you can't give any other explanation for that, lo and behold, the scientists had to completely reverse their position and say, well, yeah, the universe is not only expanding, but even now they discovered more recently that the rate of expansion is even increasing. And look, the point being that we as Muslims, we're not saying, oh, look, it's a scientific miracle here. We're saying that what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has mentioned in terms of that the heavens and the earth have been created and they are being expanded, it conforms to reality that's been established. But don't take those statements and start looking for science to support those statements, because you're going backwards about it. That's not why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is talking about those things. I think we've lost everyone here. Was it that bad?
I think so. Yeah, it's.
Oh my! I need to retire from this then. Oh no.
Yeah. So yeah, alhamdulillah, this sort of thing is like, it's a very good subject, and I think we need to bring this out, because even I sort of started to sort of think, you sort of see all these things coming out, all these other people that Yusuf was talking about earlier, making it these sort of things, the miracles, Quran, and you sort of get caught up in all of it. Sure. And then to look at it, because like the one I sort of had a little bit of trying to understand is like where it says the two seas meet but they don't mix. Yeah. Because it seems that, yes, in certain areas, but I don't think they continue totally unmixed forever. It seems so. I think it's the concepts to sort of think, well, look at this because they're talking about one is, I think, salt water and fresh water. There's like different weights and things like that, or different sort of compositions, so that sort of they tend to stay a little bit apart, and that sort of thing. So I think it's like I said before, it's like to get us to contemplate and research and just look at the magnificence of the Creator, how He does things.
I think so. Can I just respond to this comment here? That the issue is how each person takes, does science prove the Quran right, or does the Quran prove the science right? I think anyone who's comparing the two, you're comparing apples and oranges, and that's fundamentally it. The Quran is not like, we can't keep saying it, it's not a book of science. The Quran makes statements that conform to established reality, and if there is a statement that contradicts what apparently science is saying today, then as Muslims, our certainty and our trust is placed within the Quran because of the authorship. Sorry, Yusuf, we can't hear anything you're saying.
Yeah, because the Quran is from Allah, where everything else is from human beings, which is who are created by Allah.
If I got time, can I just also give an example of a limitation of science? Right. Yes. So here's a limitation that I tend to use in when I'm doing training and stuff. So here's a limitation of science, guys. I want you to listen, and ladies, of course. I'm saying guys as mankind collectively, generally. Right. Can you prove scientifically that your great 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 grandfather was not a virgin, right? And I would put it to you that it is impossible to prove that. Now, we know that he must have existed and he must have obviously had a relationship, because obviously we are the result of that progeny. Yeah. Because if there was no relationship there, especially at that time, you would never have a child, and therefore he would never be part of our lineage in the first place. But that's logic. That's literally logic, which is a separate branch of epistemology. We're talking about purely scientifically, which is to experiment with the natural world. So you would have to basically dig up the remains of this individual if you can find one, because bear in mind, at that level, you've got about 1,024 potential grandfathers. So you have to find one of these 1,024 graves, dig them up and see if there is anything there. And then what are you going to do? Try and compare DNA? Okay, fine. Even if you manage to extract some DNA there, that's only that's only from the male lineage as well. Don't forget you have the female lineage. So this person is only one of 2,000 contributors to your DNA, which is such a ridiculously small sample set of your DNA. That's below the margin of error. So you can't use DNA to prove it. You can't see any remains in this if their skeleton still remains. You can't see any remains on this skeleton to see did they actually manage to father a child. Because okay, you can probably tell whether they hit the age of puberty, but you have no way to know whether they actually, when any emissions manage to actually reach an egg and have that egg reach maturity. Sorry, the question should have actually have been fathered a child rather. But do you see the problem here? You've got these scientific limitations here because when you're looking at the natural world, even in this small example,
Assalamu alaikum. You guys hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. Alhamdulillah, you're back in.
Yeah, you can't do that from purely a naturalistic perspective. You have to rely upon logic to fill in the gaps, and that's where a lot of people fall down, is when they just rely on science on its own and they forget the other aspects of epistemology. You can't come to truth just from just that one perspective. Thank you. There you are. I've had my monologue. I've had a lot of
monologue. Sheikh Fahad, are you back in? No, he's gone. The gremlins are here. I think we've got another virus to tackle with.
I don't know. Have the other guys given up?
I think.
Okay.
It's mainly you because it's a little bit out of my depth.
Okay, so how much time do we have? So okay. So let me. We're kind of coming up to 9 o'clock. It's Maghrib time here as well. Anyway, let me just very, very quickly talk about the topic of evolution, right? Because I think evolution really sums up this topic very, very nicely. So evolution is the whole big thing now. It's the whole thing that everybody is jumping on the bandwagon of. Now, I want you guys to listen to me very, very carefully, and not to cut me off in terms of interpret what I say before I finished. I believe in evolution, and I accept the scientific. These are two separate statements. Number one, I believe in evolution. Number two, I accept the scientific explanation of evolution as scientifically valid. Okay, as a Muslim, and this doesn't contradict my faith at all. But let me explain what these mean. Number one, I believe in evolution. So we have to understand the semantics now. What exactly is evolution? Evolution is just basically progressive change. That's it. I believe in progressive change of everything. You can have, software evolves, your hardware, your phones evolve, research evolves. People can make changes. And here's the biggest proof that you can see even just between the two of us, there is a clear biological difference between us. We are all from an Islamic perspective, we are all the children of Adam and Eve. Yet you have a look at the people of the world, and we are pretty much every single color, all the way from the whitest of white to the blackest of black, and every single shade in between.
Shape,
size, hair color, and things like that. Yeah. That variation comes from somewhere. Okay, so believing that we as human beings have changed and can change and have this methodology, that nothing in that contradicts my belief. In fact, actually, that affirms my belief, because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentions that we've created you with different tribes that you can get to know one another. Okay, so there's nothing wrong with that. The problem comes down to if someone takes my statement and say I believe in evolution, to infer that I'm saying that I believe in the scientific method of evolution known as Darwinism, which is a completely different thing, where that calls for life to be spontaneously created just because some certain chemicals mix. That I don't believe in. But the idea of progressive change, that's fine. Now, to come to the second point, that I accept the scientific explanation of evolution to be scientifically valid. This is because, again, science has confined itself only to a naturalistic explanation. And they've kind of painted themselves into a corner here, where we know from scientific experimentation that and biology and things like that, the organisms evolve. Let's just call it, for want of another phrase, microevolution, right? When you rewind the clock back, there is a question that comes into play as to, well, where did the first cell come from? And this is the one that scientists can't answer. But the methodology of science, which requires a natural explanation, forces them to come up with some kind of a natural explanation, which is just to say, well, okay, there was inorganic matter there. Somehow it must have just mixed together and become organic. Obviously, as Muslims, we'll say that, no, this was the power of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala breathing life into things, just creating us in one go. But of course, that's outside the boundaries of science. Within science, the only thing you can come up with is a natural explanation. So, which is why I accept, and this is why I said it very carefully, that the scientific explanation of evolution, I accept that as scientifically valid, because if you confine yourself to these rules, that is the only conclusion you can come up with.
Yeah.
The problem is not that they came up with the wrong conclusion within the rules. The problem is that these rules prohibit the rules and the methodology of science prohibit from being able to look at anything outside of the naturalistic world, and it presumes a position of atheism to begin with. So only when we actually understand what is being talked about, what is being discussed, and where we can draw where we can accept certain things and where we can draw our differences, only then can we really have progressive discussions with people who adopt these ideas. So, for example, if some when I'm talking to, for example, an atheist who believes in evolution, and in his head he's seen microevolution, again, we're using back to that term where biology has progressive changes, this, that, and the other. If I just said to him, well, I don't believe in evolution, full stop, he's going to look at me like I'm nuts, because there are certain things that can be observed. But if I just say to him, look, I accept all of that, but I do not accept that, look, life spontaneously created itself, nor did certain species branch off and become other things. We can have a discussion there, because science only speculates about those things because it's forced to. There is no specific scientific evidence that actually says that this is exactly what happened. And even the thing that they speculate that happened, that all of these chemicals and came together and just magically made the magical set of proteins required for life, they still can't produce that. They and believe me, they've tried. They still can't replicate that. So the very origins of life, in whatever they've speculated, it's speculation. They can't reproduce it. And therein is the problem and the limitation with their faith. And again, with certain dua that try to combat this issue of scientism, a lot of it comes down to semantics and actually understanding what the issue is, rather than relying on buzzwords and things like that. So, we need to step up our game in terms of understanding what they're talking about, and also make it clear, look, let's not rely on these buzzwords and labels and things like that. We need to define very, very carefully what exactly is it that we're talking about here. When we're talking about evolution, what are we talking about?
Just to say, add in something there. It's like some of the people's talk about, like, a tornado goes through a junkyard, and all of a sudden, like what is it? The latest jet comes out the other end. From all the bits of junk have got together, and all of a sudden, a jet engine comes out. Plane comes out the other side. So you rationally thinking you can't. Well, that doesn't happen.
Well, yeah. I mean, but atheists will believe that of the origin of the universe, because there's this stupidly small, ridiculous odds of it coming together by chance, because the scientific methodology forces them to come to that, to leave only that conclusion open, because
they've got the blinkers.
Because they're only looking at the natural effect. They can't consider the supernatural. They can't say, okay, look. So here's the point. If you go to that junkyard and you see that jet there, right? Someone would say, well, okay, that was a supernatural entity that obviously, ordered it, created this, that, and the other. But from the scientific methodology alone, and this is the problem, when you put it in its own box and you don't allow any other things to permeate that box, you can only come up with a natural explanation. What's the only alternative explanation you can come up with? Well, it must have just fell together by itself. If nobody else did it, it must have just happened by itself. And that's their problem. that they put themselves in this box, and then they don't recognize that they've put themselves in this box.
Yeah.
So one of the strengths that I actually promote in Dawah is to open their eyes for them to recognize that they've put themselves in this box that doesn't adequately explain every aspect and facet of reality, and therein is the problem.
Yeah. I think Alhamdulillah was a very good explanation, and I think that we've sort of done our time, and I think we've lost half our crew. I think it's probably time to, I think, finish off and thank everyone for coming along, those of our guests who sort of were in and out, and I appreciate Brother Jamshed for putting a very good explanation, as some of the people were saying, good explanation on evolution. It's the only way really can look at it, with a solid mind.
So
Sure.
I haven't got it here, but if anyone, so I've written a number of posts about this. I'm not famous on Facebook and things like that because I hate the idea of just writing stuff for the sake of being popular. I prefer to let the work speak for itself. But I do have a Facebook page called Dawah with Jamshed, so DAWAH with JAMSHED. I have a number of old posts on there that go into this and explain various different aspects of this stuff. So feel free to check any of that out, or if you want to just drop me a message there, I'm happy to respond. But otherwise, I will see you again, inshallah, next time. Jazakallah.
Inshallah, and maybe we can continue this discussion, inshallah.
Yeah, definitely.
Yep. Thank you very much for listening, and we'll see you next time. Jazakallah khair. Assalamu alaikum.